In 1931, the celebrated Marxist revolutionary Bhagat Singh sent a final letter to the governor of Punjab before he would be hanged by the British for the assassination of a police official. The letter read, "Let us declare that the state of war does exist and shall exist so long as the Indian toiling masses are being exploited by a handful of parasites. They may be British capitalist, or mixed British and Indian, or purely Indian. All these things make no difference.
Ever since India became an independent sovereign country, it has behaved like a colonial power. From the moment it won independence, it has been at war. Nagaland, Manipur, Punjab, Kashmir, the Naxalite movement in West Bengal, Telangana. They blame the Maoists for believing in protracted war. But here is a state that believes in protracted war, that has killed 68,000 people, or that war has killed 68,000 people in Kashmir alone. There's no body count in the Northeast. We have laws like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act that allows non-commissioned officers to kill on sight, and we call ourselves a democracy. Talking about bloodthirsty Maoists and their violence, you can't see it, but that's a picture of a chief minister who you all know, whose name begins with N and whose surname begins with M. And he's doing puja to AK-47s and to SLRs. And it says Gujarat CM worships weapons at his residence in Gandhinagar. Okay, so none of us worship weapons, at least I don't. But the point is, what is going on in this country?
An indigenous activist from Bastar had her hands forced behind her back by one man as another applied an acid-like substance to her face, causing severe chemical wounds. The men were linked to local politicians and the police who wanted to silence her for talking about police atrocities against indigenous women. The buzz of bees that indigenous people are used to hearing as they harvest honey has become associated with another buzz above their heads, the buzz of Israeli heron drones that stalk their homes for signs of so-called Maoist rebels. And occasionally they drop a bomb in an attempt to scare the indigenous people into leaving their villages. A flood of blood-red mud bleed into the lakes and water sources of the Indians who live there. Water sources that are vital for everyday farming and life. The red mud brings cancer and radioactive blight that slowly kills not only the people, but all forms of life that it touches. Any forms of resistance to this assault on the life of their land itself by its inhabitants is met with fierce and violent repression by the Indian state. Whether it be factions of Maoist guerrilla fighters or indigenous activists in the forest, or city dwellers who speak up and recognize the humanity of the people in this region, the state moves quickly to crush it. The world's largest democracy and so-called fourth largest economy has been eating its own limbs as a sacrifice to the free market, while it paints its face for the world with a smile.
कोई घटना वटना करने आया रहा हूँ, देख लो कौन है, क्या है, तस्दीक कर लो, उसके बाद तो सब लिखा पढ़ी बन जाती है, देख लेना। अब उधर का जो है संभाले रहना, सब अधिकारी सब फोर्स इधर उधर कराए, हाई अलर्ट रहना, और उधर से कोई भी पत्रकार जो है, मतलब जो नक्सलियों को कवर करने जाएगा, उसको सीधा मरवा देना, समझ गए? राजा सर
This is a disclaimer to any government officials watching this video. I am not a part of any political organization formally in India, nor do I support violence. This video is purely for educational purposes, with information from publicly available sources and not banned literature that is readily available for purchase within India itself. I'm just some guy who roasts coffee and teaches baristas how to make a better cup outside this channel. I do this because I value education and find these topics interesting. And I believe that the common person deserves to have easy access to information like this. I have to say this because the world's largest democracy also ranks number 151 out of 180 countries in journalistic freedom, according to Reporters Without Borders. Indian journalists and artists who are prominent, or a lot more prominent than this tiny channel, who speak up about this subject specifically are either assassinated, like Gauri Lankesh, by a group calling themselves the SS, who are then, of course, released on bail because it serves the politicians in power, or they tend to be accused of being a member of a banned organization and thrown in jail without evidence or formal charges under the UAPA. And to be frank, I think we all know that evidence is something to be planted by the police, not found. The Naxalite movement is known as the longest surviving continuous armed struggle in the world, beginning in 1967. Various Indian governments have sought to eliminate the movement altogether, from Operation Steeplechase to Operation Green Hunt, and now in the current era, Operation Kagar, for which the Home Minister of India boasted and said that the deadline for the elimination would be March 2026. With this latest and perhaps most violent and high-tech war on the poorest people in India, this has turned into a rather one-sided extermination campaign of Adivasi people. With that being said, in this video, I will attempt to provide a comprehensive history of the Naxalite movement, the relationship between India's tribal communities, the Naxals, the state, and private corporations. We will go over the financial motives of the government and the corporations involved, and the billionaire-run propaganda campaigns to manufacture consent among the city-dwelling Indian populations. We will also cover the real roots of division within the left in India, because you really cannot understand the left in India without understanding the Naxalite movement. And more importantly, beyond these labels of Maoist, Naxalite, and so on, what we will learn is that this is just a continuation of a very long war on the Adivasi people of India.
Reynolds Wrap, be kind, your pocketbook days are here. And here I am again, with giant.
गलती आपकी नहीं, घर का खाना भी देर तक पड़ा रहे तो हानिकारक कीटाणु हमला बोल सकते हैं, इसलिए चांस मत लो। खाना पैक करने के लिए 14 माइक्रोन थिक
With your feet, think of all the things you can do. Like wrap potatoes for baking, cover leftovers, line broiling.
You know what this is? It's aluminium, or as the Americans say, aluminum, commonly used to wrap a sandwich or to can a beer. It's used in electronics as well, in cars. You know what else it's used for? Now, considering how important this metal is, how is it made? Well, you first need a rock called bauxite. About 4 to 5 tons of bauxite can be refined into 2 tons of alumina. And those 2 tons of alumina undergoes electrolysis and turns into 1 ton of aluminium. Bauxite can be found in the Earth's crust, in laterite soil. It's a red clay-like material that naturally forms in tropical lush climates. Intense weathering of rock through a combination of heavy rainfall and warm temperature is what produces it in nature. The Niamgiri hills of Orissa are a great example of one such climate. The hills of southern Orissa have been home to the Dongria Kond tribe long before there was even a country called India. Like many of India's forgotten tribes, especially in resource-rich forests, more than 82% of the Dongria Kond households live under India's poverty line. The hills and forests of the region have sustained their people for thousands of years. It is so important to the community that it is considered a deity by itself. These hills have been sold by the Indian government to a foreign UK-based corporation called Vedanta. It is one of the largest mining corporations in the world, owned by British billionaire Anil Agarwal, who lives in London in a mansion that once belonged to the Shah of Iran. This is merely one of the many international mining corporations that have been extracting resources in Orissa and the region. The Dongri Kond people know from the experiences of other tribes in the area with mining corporations that if this company were to be allowed to mine in their homeland, their water sources would dry up due to the immense amount of water required to refine bauxite, which would cut their yearly farming harvests in half, and the waste produced by the refinery will poison the land, like it has in many other parts of India. According to Samendran Das and Felix Patel, in their book, Out of This Earth, East India Adivasis and the Aluminium Cartel, the financial value of the bauxite deposits of Orissa alone is $2.27 trillion in 2004 prices. Of this value, the government is said to receive a cut of merely 7%. In many cases, if it's a well-known MNC, the bauxite would have been pre-sold in the futures market, even though people still live on the mountains and no mining has even begun. The corporations then treat the mountains itself as a living storage facility, a living, breathing custodian of what they claim is their inventory. And when it comes time to extract, if the mining cannot be done peacefully, it will be done violently with state support. Paramilitary troops in uniform and ununiformed SPOs or special police officers, deputized for a wage barely sustaining a wretched existence, with promises of acceptance into the mainstream Hindu fold, without oversight to wreak havoc on the rest of the tribal population. The free market over the lives of India's poorest people. Despite repeated arrests, coordinated violent harassment campaigns with the political weight of the Indian state apparatus, the Dongri Kond won a lawsuit against the multinational mining company and Anil Agarwal. This was massive at the time. However, the Indian state had already promised its favorite billionaires a slice. So they began to set up police camps in the region, reasoning that the Dongria were actually Maoists, and this extra security was needed to secure the region. Many tribal activists protesting police brutality at the hands of the state were arrested. Bari Pirikaka, a Dongria tribal activist, died in prison in 2017 after he was arrested in 2015. He was abducted by the police as he made his way home from a protest. It's more accurate to say that he was murdered by them. The police also arrested 20-year-old Kuni Sikaka, who was dragged out of her house after midnight. No warrant or due process. She was then paraded and displayed in front of officials and corrupt gluttonous media thirsting for red meat. The Indian state officials over here declared that she was a surrendered Maoist, which they didn't need to provide any evidence for. You see, it works the other way around. You say someone's a Maoist, so you don't need to provide evidence. Now, that's just a drop in the ocean of stories of people who have been wronged in the name of mining in Orissa. But there's iron ore, limestone, granite, tin, copper, diamond, silica, uranium, dolomite, and many more across Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand. The government has signed hundreds upon hundreds of MOUs, or memorandums of understanding, for infrastructure projects like aluminium smelters. All, of course, without the knowledge or consent of the Indians living in those areas. This resource-rich region, known as Dandakaranya forest, is a massive, unimaginably beautiful, lush region, home to millions of India's indigenous communities. These communities have survived multiple invasions over centuries and operate with their own self-governing and farming practices, with a respect for the land and environment that would be alien for the billionaire sitting in London. Corporations have been lining up to steal more of these tribal lands, even though Schedule 5 of the Constitution prevents this, or it's supposed to prevent it. That's right, Schedule 5 provides Adivasi people protection and is meant to prevent the alienation of their land. These pesky constitutional provisions, though, are seen as unfavorable to the free market. As business people would say, it creates unfavorable business conditions. So in order to clear these beautiful resource-rich regions of these Indians living off of it so that foreign corporations can feast upon its natural resources and a few board members can get rich, the government declared Operation Green Hunt in 2009, backed by an elaborate propaganda campaign by the media, whitewashing and deifying the paramilitary troops and state-backed militias and their atrocities, while demonizing all indigenous people. The then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, who we will talk about later, declared at the time that left-wing extremism was the biggest internal threat to India. The liberal billionaire brainchild of this human hunting operation was the then Home Minister P. Chidambaram of Tamil Nadu, who actually gave a lecture about his motives at Harvard 2 years beforehand in 2007. And rather coincidentally, Chidambaram also used to be the top director at Vedanta and only stepped down a day before he became the finance minister of India in 2004. This is the same billionaire who said to the Economic Times in 2010, and I quote, "The Maoists are among the most crafty capitalists in the country." This is also the same billionaire who would be arrested later in 2019 by the CBI, the Central Bureau of Intelligence, for corruption and money laundering. Former Finance Minister of India, everyone. Every accusation is a confession. Polite liberal society in the cities will and have seen all this as a necessary evil in the name of development. Unfortunately, many of our fellow Indians will look the other way. We know this because this has been going on for decades now. I'm sure we might get some mini essays in the comments from liberals whose ethics will fly out the window at the drop of a hat when it comes to the rights of the indigenous people living in these regions. Some might even say that, hey, the factories and refineries will bring jobs. If only it were that simple. Besides the minuscule cut the Indian government makes on these resource extraction contracts, many of the profits will go to the corporations, who have no intention of building anything for the local population. Just like the British before them, they are only interested in using India as a mine, nothing more. Hundreds of thousands of Adivasis are displaced from their lands illegally. Many are forced to move into slums in major cities like Mumbai, and you won't hear much about it from mainstream outlets in India or even many mainstream YouTubers and content creators. Part of it is due to the very real threat of political violence and repression by the state and far-right militias, and the government's own use of draconian suppression laws like the UAPA, which allows the government to detain citizens on suspicion that they might commit a terrorist attack in the future. Evidence? Well, it's whatever the government wants it to be. Israeli spyware like Pegasus makes the question of evidence quite simple, especially when city-dwelling leftists are concerned. For the tribal people in the forest, however, who may not even have smartphones, it's a much more direct approach. So a lot of people are forced to keep quiet. Indians living in rural areas are painfully aware of the ways that the state is willing to brush them aside. But a lot of people living in the cities are not aware of the full extent of what is happening in these regions. All they get in the news is that Maoists are ambushing innocent paramilitary vehicles carrying innocent paramilitary officers, or enter number of Maoists eliminated by a successful operation or something, earning the soldiers a big bounty and payday. That's all the city-dwelling public hears. Keep in mind that these Adivasi communities, the Ho, the Oraon, the Kols, the Mundas, the Gonds, and the Santals have a long history of armed resistance against colonial powers in the region. Long before Mao was even born, the history of the Santal tribe, the tribe of the current president, President Murmu, is a great example of this. In the same region that the Maoists are fighting in right now, as I write this, the Santal tribe rebelled against the British East India Company in 1855. They rebelled against the British Army and the privileged caste zamindars, who were landlords. Most Indians do look at that part of our history and say, wow, what a great anti-colonial struggle. You'll even see right-wingers co-opting this. But if that rebellion were to happen today, the same people would call them terrorists, Maoists, Naxals, and anti-India without a doubt. And we know that they would, because the current Maoist insurgency is comprised of a large amount of Santals. In fact, one of the original founders was Jungle Santal from the same tribe. India is one of, if not the most diverse places on the planet. So we also need to take into account the ethnic differences between these people who live in these regions and the CRPF and BSF forces and state security forces who come in to enforce the state's violence. Let's take the largest indigenous group in the region, the Gond. The Gond speak a Dravidian language that India calls the Gondi, and the Gond people themselves call Koitur. Like the Orawan calls Munda and Santals of East and Central India, they are descendants of people groups who've been on this landmass for more than 60,000 years. Like other tribes in the region, the Gond people practice a form of democratic self-governance, in which hunter-gatherer communes collectively elect representatives. They elect a person to the position of village headman and so on through a council of elders. These various councils and tribal communities exist in different parts of the forest, but also manage to coexist through marriages and trade and so on. What unites them is the indigenous philosophy of Jal, Jungle, Jameen, water, forest and land. Due to a long history of coming into contact with external kingdoms, whether they be Indian or European, some of the affluent Gond headmen became kings themselves, and they were basically used as middlemen to rule over the peasant Gonds as their landlords. This is another factor that is barely mentioned when talking about the long persistent existence of the Maoists in the region. The decentralized tribal democracies in the region do come into conflict with the deeply hierarchical and centralized power structures of the state.
Authority of our government is not existing. We must go and establish ourselves. This is why, over the years of this kind of neglect, that the Naxalites started running their own kind of janadalats and own rules and own kind of activity, and we have to bring about order in this disorder.
This difference in how power structures are perceived is also reflected in the fighting forces engaged in this conflict. You see, the tribal people who decide to pick up arms and join the Maoist insurgency are 50% female, as opposed to the state-sponsored militias like the Salwa Judum, who are 100% male, and the CRPF and BSF and other state security forces, which are predominantly male and not from the region. In fact, a rather sad reality is that a majority of the CRPF and BSF forces who have to engage in hot war on the front lines tend to also be from marginalized communities themselves, from other hot zones, usually from other border states like Kashmir, Assam, Punjab. Regions within these border states tend to be underdeveloped with no jobs, so joining these security forces tend to be an easy way to get employment. The commanders of these forces, though, tend to be from more affluent families from the cities. They get to sit back, get an inflated paycheck, and not have to engage in any of the dirty work. They get the glory while the poor shed the blood. The average monthly pay of a CRPF soldier is around 25,500 rupees a month, which is just under $300. The newer locally raised DRG or District Reserve Guard get a similar pay, plus any bonuses of any dead bodies they retrieve and claim bounties on. The SPOs, or the deputized non-uniformed indigenous people hired by the state as informants, receive just 1,500 rupees. That's like $17. These indigenous participants are usually not allowed to come back to their villages and are usually seen as traitors. So they instead live in these government camps that are sprinkled throughout the forest. This naturally causes tension within tribes as well, of suspected government informants and spies, which of course leads to violence. While that is the reality for the poor average person on the government side, the heads of these departments that I mentioned before, well, especially in departments like the CRPF, they make most of their money in bribes, with recent high-profile cases brought forth by the CBI themselves. Take this case of the CRPF's so-called elite anti-Naxal unit, Cobra, which has been known for intentionally failing candidates so they could extort them for bribes. These prospective candidates tend to be from lower class backgrounds, just like the average grunt in any military anywhere. The motive to join is usually monetary and not as nationalistic as the middle classes. As is the case with many issues in India, those calling for peace and dialogue are typically branded as anti-India and traitors, terror sympathizers, and urban Naxals. One side seeks to preserve indigenous land for indigenous people, whereas the other side seeks to steal indigenous land and sell it to international billionaires in the name of development. The monetary stakes are quite high for the Indian state and the middle classes. So what's a few dead Indians? So the Indian state doesn't really care or bother with diplomacy. Peace talks are typically used like a fisherman uses a lure to catch fish.
In India, questions remain over the death of a top Maoist leader who died Friday alongside a freelance journalist who was interviewing him. Indian officials say Charu Majkumar died in a gun battle, but supporters of the Maoist leader, who is commonly known as Azad, said he died in police custody.
The case of the assassination of the Maoist chief negotiator Azad, otherwise known as Cherukuri Rajkumar, by the police after the Maoists had agreed to talk with the state, is a good example of this tactic. In July of 2010, Azad had been traveling by train with a young journalist, Hemchandra Pandey. They were on their way to discuss a possible ceasefire and peace talks with other members of the Maoist party. But before they could make it to their meeting, they were stopped by the police and taken to the remote forests of Adilabad in true Indian police fashion. The police then shot the unarmed Azad at point-blank range and then killed the journalist, Hemchandra Pandey. Why? Well, just because. They reasoned it away to the Indian media as a gunfight, initiated conveniently by Azad and the journalist, which in turn forced the police to return fire. However, doctors who conducted post-mortem tests pointed out the telltale signs of point-blank gunfire and burn marks in the course of a war. If, in the preliminary stages of a peace negotiation, one side executes the envoy of the other side, it's reasonable to assume that the side that did the killing does not want peace. It looks very much as though Azad was killed because someone decided that the stakes were too high to allow him to remain alive. I've mentioned Maoists quite a bit already, but I haven't really explained what Maoism has to do with much of this yet. What is a Naxalite? What do they want? What is the ideology that drives them? So let's take a step back and understand that. For this story, we will begin at the foothills of the Himalayas, in Naxalbari village, in the district of Darjeeling, where you get that lovely tea from in West Bengal, in which the British used indigenous labor to grow opium to flood into China. In the 60s, a third of the population here were tribal peasants and sharecroppers who worked the plantations. In the words of journalist and author Amit Bhattacharya, in the year 1947, the British rulers handed over power to friendly and reliable hands. The period since has been a long agony for the struggling masses. No social revolution preceded or followed the transfer of power. The two social classes, the comprador big bourgeois and the feudal class, which had served as the pillars of colonial rule, became the ruling classes of India. The rule of imperialism had continued under the new signboard of freedom and independence. India had only been independent from Britain for about 20 years at this point of the story, and the privileged caste bourgeois political class of India that took over had retained the colonial zamindari systems the British had implemented. It was a system of tax collection that was identical to medieval European feudal systems, where landlords would sublease their lands to peasants and extracted a lion's share of the yield as taxes for the empire. The British granted the zamindaris land in exchange for the service of middle management. In Naxalbari, through this system, 4% of the wealthiest in the region owned most of the land, while more than 60% remained landless. The origins of the Naxalbari peasants' misery stems from the exploitation they faced at the hands of the landlords and wealthy peasants of the area. Naturally, this was a tense environment. On May 21st, Bigul Kishan, a peasant, entered a plot of land that he had been harvesting crops at for decades. That plot of land, however, was owned by Ishwar Tirki, a local landlord and a Congress party leader. Tirki sent his goons to beat up Bigul. The goons thrashed Bigul, almost crushed his head in, and then took away his farming implements and his oxen to teach him a lesson. This was harrowing, but Bigul was not alone. Like most farmers in the region, he was a member of the Krishak Sabha, a peasant wing of the largest communist party in India at the time, the CPIM, or CPI Marxist. When word spread of what had happened, a group of peasants armed with bows and arrows, led by local communist leaders like Prahlad Singh and Muzibur Rahman, attacked the house of the landlord, despite knowing that the landlord was armed. Tirki, the landlord, fled, and the police were called in to shoot at and arrest the protesters. This obviously did nothing to rectify the situation. In fact, peasants all over the region had had enough of the exploitation, so they began to organize and occupy the fields of their landlords, and also take over granaries. More police were called into the area, and this time to evict the peasants who had taken over the fields. Shanti Munda of the Munda tribe, a communist leader and revolutionary who is still alive, by the way, one of the last surviving members of the Naxalbari uprising, led the peasant resistance against the police. She had just given birth 15 days beforehand, yet led groups of Adivasi peasants to surround police cars and take their weapons. During these clashes, Sonam Wangdi, a notorious local police officer, is alleged to have kicked a pregnant woman, and in retaliation, one of the Adivasi peasants shot 2 poisoned arrows at Wangdi, who died the next day from them. The cops, of course, weren't going to let this slide. They came back the next day with a vengeance. Groups of Adivasi women had set up roadblocks around Naxalbari. One of these roadblocks stopped a police car. The police pleaded with the group to let them pass, saying that they were only here to collect the weapons. The Adivasi women agreed, and a few minutes later, the police returned with the weapons that they had taken back and opened fire on the women who had led them through. They killed a reported 9 women and 2 children as revenge for Sonam Wangdi. I'll shorten it here, but things continued to escalate, and leaders like Charu Mazumdar, Jungle Santal, and Kanu Sanyal led more peasant revolts throughout the region, which spread to various regions across India. This became known as the Naxalite movement, getting its name from the village in which it all ignited, Naxalbari. On 5th July 1967, the People's Daily, an organ of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, released an editorial titled Spring Thunder Over India. It was also covered by Peking Radio.
And what do you sacrifice?
Calm, kindness, kinship, love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I've made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago for which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, has set me on a path from which there's no escape. I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. What do I sacrifice? Everything!
Charu Mazumdar had been a long-time communist who had joined the fight against British imperialism at the age of 19. He initially joined the Congress Social Party, a party that split away from the Gandhian Congress Party. But just a year later, when the Communist Party of India was formed in 1925, he joined to work under its peasant organization. Even though the party was initially banned by the British, Charu continued to organize peasants in Jalpaiguri district and became quite notorious among British officials who had issued an arrest warrant for him. When World War II broke out, Churchill began to redirect food from Bengal to supply British and American troops. This, along with other factors, caused the Great Bengal Famine of 1943, when millions of Indians starved to their ends. and many millions more became impoverished. During this apocalyptic time, Charu Majumdar organized crop seizure operations to feed the workers. After surviving that period in 1946, he joined the Tebaga movement in North Bengal, another less talked about proletarian militant struggle that united 6 million Hindu and Muslim workers to join hands and turn against their Hindu and Muslim landlords, who had the cover of the Muslim League-led government. As was the norm for communists at the time, Charu and his wife, who was also a communist, among others, would be arrested and spend time in jail for 3 years. This lifelong immersion in proletarian struggle, police repression, and surviving famine helped shape his worldview through an Indian context, along with studying streams of communist thought from the Soviets and China. Charu's party back then, the CPI, like him, had been fanning the flames of a proletarian revolution in India for decades. However, the growing differences between the USSR and China began to cause internal fractures within the Indian Communist Party. To keep it simple and for the sake of this video's length, the orthodox Marxists believed that a workers' revolution would be led by a politicized, educated, and mobilized urban working class. Mao, on the other hand, did not believe that an industrialized vanguard was necessary. Instead, he believed that the peasant masses could move towards socialism through agrarian revolutions and land reform. In light of these debates and fractures, the Communist Party of India decided to seek some clarity. So on February 9th, 1951, representatives of the CPI traveled to Moscow to meet with Stalin. The full transcript of their conversation will be referenced in the references community post. But he essentially explained that India was not at the correct stage for revolution at the time. He explained that they were not ready for a full partisan war. In his view, conditions in China were much more favorable for a protracted people's war. He also noted that China had a trained People's Liberation Army, which the Indian communists just didn't have. He said that as things stand, no matter what detachments or liberated areas you create, they would remain as little islands without reliable support or connectivity. You don't have a friendly neighboring country on which you could rely as a backbone, as the Chinese partisans created, having the USSR at their back. Burma, Pakistan, these are all land borders and the rest are maritime. The Chinese way was good for China. People do theorize that Stalin's attempt to de-radicalize and defang the CPI at this time was also strategic because he was also trying to maintain a relationship with the Congress-led Indian government. But regardless, Stalin concluded that the conditions were insufficient for a victory, especially if you are not able to combine a proletarian struggle in the cities with a struggle of the peasants in rural areas. The reality at the time was that India had just become independent, still reeling from partition and the India-Pakistan War. The CPI decided that attempting a full-scale armed revolution would have to wait, and electoral politics would have to do for now until the conditions were right. To which critics of the CPI today also say that their revolution has been postponed to the afterlife. It is also speculated that this conversation with Stalin also caused the communists to pull out of the Tebaga movement. It caused them to stop using tactics of armed rebellion and guerrilla warfare. This caused internal conflicts within the leadership, and the Indian army took the opportunity to take the offensive to the remainder of the divided peasant rebels and called for all communists to surrender. Many who sided with the CPI at the time chose to give up their struggle and surrender, while others who were disillusioned with the party and felt that the decision discredited the original CPI went on to split and form the CPIM or CPI Marxist. Charu Majumdar was one of the founding members of this CPI Marxist, and the party originally aligned with Mao's path for revolution. Just a year later, however, when India and Pakistan would go to war a second time in 20 years, the Chinese had chosen to strategically side with Pakistan. This caused massive division once more within the CPIM. Members denounced Beijing's support for Rawalpindi, Pakistan's old capital, but Charu Majumdar and other members committed to Mao's path saw this as an ideological betrayal. The hardened revolutionary had seen these changes as revisionism and was frustrated because he felt that the communist leadership in India had essentially given up, taking the wind out of the revolutionary potential. And you can see his anger in his writings while he was still in the party. However, even though he disagreed with the CPIM forming coalitions with centrist and bourgeois parties in electoral politics, he continued his work with the peasant wing. Unfortunately, as he feared, the collaboration with bourgeois parties caused a situation where the system as a whole could not implement effective land reforms. These ineffective land reforms created the structural problems that would lead to the 1967 Naxalbari uprising. About 15,000 to 20,000 peasants began to do full-time work to build up peasant committees in villages. The young men of the villages who had never before been seen in the front ranks of the Kisan Sabha now occupied the place of veteran peasant cadres. With the speed of a storm, the revolutionary peasants, in the course of about 1.5 months, formed peasant committees through hundreds of group meetings and turned these committees into armed village defense groups. In a word, they organized about 90% of the village population. This action of the peasants completely changed all our old ideas about organization. We were unable to raise the struggle firmly to a higher stage because we failed to rely wholly on the people and to build a powerful mass base. We now admit frankly that we had no faith in the heroic peasant masses who, swift as a storm, organized themselves, formed revolutionary peasant committees, completed the 10 great tasks and advanced the class struggle at a swift pace during the period from April to September 1967. We did not realize that it is the people who make history, that they are the real heroes, that the people can organize themselves and can amaze all by their own completely new style of work. Charu Majumdar, after the Naxalbari uprising, felt that the time was ripe for revolt. So he declared what would become his most infamous policy, the line of annihilation, calling for the annihilation of all class enemies, which included landlords, moneylenders, and authorities, and so on. He also called for the boycott of all elections. With this, he began to lose some of his own supporters at the time. Doubt started to creep in. Even some of the Adivasi community in the region began to fear them instead of galvanizing mass support. Many surviving members of the original movement have also said that the line of annihilation was simply a mistake. It was a bet that simply did not play out the way Charu assumed it would. Other communist leaders across the country began to note that Charu's movement had the characteristics of infantile adventurism. Kesab Sarkar, one of the original Naxalite Maoists, said in 1987, "After our release from prison in 1968, we could not control the situation. At that point, we decided to boycott all elections. That was a mistake too. Why boycott the elections? We couldn't explain that to the masses." Charu Majumdar's line of annihilation of class enemies continued into the 1970s. As a result, we became completely disconnected from the greater population. People became scared of the Naxalites. They couldn't support us anymore. Shanti Munda, who I mentioned before as being a prominent Adivasi organizer in the movement, said in 1987, "Most of the people and activists who had joined the struggle with us in 1967 would say that the ideological line we had adopted then was right. The common peasants at that time had a strong conviction in their dream of changing the social order, and they joined the movement with great spontaneity. The situation, however, started changing in 1968 as we adopted the politics of annihilation. Antisocial elements started entering the party, taking full advantage of our newly adopted political line. City-bred youngsters who had by then joined our movement too started misinterpreting our line and took to killing people randomly, damaging our image among the people. It adversely affected our identity, making us seem merely a bunch of violent people to be scared of. A large number of common peasants had been killed too during that time, in the name of annihilating the class enemy. Khudar Malik, another OG of the Naxalite movement, said in 2017 to the Caravan magazine, just months before he would pass away from a brain hemorrhage, "We did not understand the line of annihilation of class enemies, but we went along with it. We could not even identify who the class enemies were. We used to wait for instructions from top leaders. We were not much aware of the political lines that we needed to follow to make the revolution possible. The urban, college-educated people brought in all sorts of theories which ultimately disintegrated our efforts." Now, they weren't the only ones aware at the time that the movement had begun to make some serious miscalculations. Abhay Das, an intelligence officer with the CBI, the Central Bureau of Investigation, had informers and agitators planted within the movement, among the new surge of Naxalite joinees. This is not speculation or conspiracy. This is something he has proudly admitted. In 1987, Abhay Das had this to say: "They adopted the annihilation of class enemies line, and at the same time, a large number of antisocial elements started making their way inside the party. We took full advantage of this. As I've already mentioned, we had informers planted within them. One has to accept the immense popularity of the movement that Charu Babu had initiated. If not for his line of annihilation, it would have been difficult for us to suppress the movement. From the initial phase of the movement, they took a few very wrong steps, and we obviously made full use of these opportunities. We could infiltrate the rank and file of their organization without our informers. We could have all the information we wanted. Take, for instance, the case of Babulal Bishwakarma. He heard that a meeting was taking place on the land of Hochai Malik. The informer was one of the participants, and he was there at the meeting too. At midnight, we surrounded the place. Everyone other than Bishwakarma managed to escape. Bishwakarma tried to hide in a bamboo grove next to the house. We started firing, and so did Bishwakarma. Bishwakarma's bullet missed our circle inspector, and instead the informer was shot in his hand. He lost 3 fingers in this incident. Later in the night, when Bishwakarma tried to crawl out of the grove, a constable noticed him and shot him dead. Today, the informer who lost his fingers has a government job. Kanu Sanyal was also arrested in a similar way from Nunojot. We were lucky there when we surrounded the house. The person in charge of the lookout had dozed off, hence there was no such exchange of firing. After arresting him, we realized that they had enough arms with which they could put up a tough fight for a long time.
You need a radical insurgency you can count on.
Count on for what?
You need Gorman rebels you can depend on to do the wrong thing.
The more violence the movement unleashed with their line of annihilation, the more state repression came down upon them. Abhay Das also still lives in Naxalbari, a remnant of state repression in the area. Chairman Mao himself also had thoughts. After the uprising, 4 members of the CPIM also visited Mao in 1967. Khudar Malik was one of the people who made that journey. The CPIM had established contact with the Communist Party of China. 4 of us, Kanu Sanyal, Deepak Bishwas, Kokon Majumdar, and I went to Debijora Tea Estate in West Dinajpur district, close to the East Pakistan border. We hid there for a few months and established contact with the East Pakistan Communist Party to send a message to the Chinese consulate in Dhaka. We were told not to come to Pakistan, but instead go to Kathmandu in Nepal. We made our way to Kathmandu through Tarbanga and Raksaul in Bihar in September 1967. There we met the Chinese ambassador, who asked us to lie low for a few days. After a week, we were smuggled to the border with Tibet in a truck carrying construction material. Local guides took us into Tibet, where the People's Liberation Army took charge. They took us to Lhasa, where we stayed for another week before we were taken to Peking. There, we were met by the Communist Party of China's Central Committee member Kang Sheng. We stayed in China for nearly 2.5 months. We were taken to Hunan to see the Red Army's training center. We were trained in guerrilla fighting. We were also taken to see how farms owned by communes were run. We saw how the farmer men and women worked in their fields while their children were being looked after by the commune. We also went to Shanghai to visit some big factories. Finally, we met Premier Zhou Enlai in December, and the following day we met Mao. He was seated in a large room. He spoke to us through translators. There were 2 translators who had studied Bangla in Dhaka and 2 who spoke Hindi and had studied in India. Finally, he said, "Only you could bring about a revolution in India." He dubbed the CPI revisionist and CPIM neo-revisionist. He said they wouldn't carry out any revolution. He also said to us, "You can do it if you remain on the right path, but you should not blindly follow China's model. Also, never let a divide creep in between the peasants and the workers and the leadership." After meeting with Chairman Mao, we came back to India using the same route. Kanu Sanyal reported on our trip to China to Charu Majumdar. Kanu Sanyal's own book confirms this account. Mao urged them to formulate their own revolutionary strategy instead of copying China's. Mao also criticized Charu's line of annihilation and said that the party had no real effective land reform policy and that annihilation alone was no substitute for an organized revolution. Back in India, despite the CPIM receiving pressure to maintain law and order from the establishment, Charu and his comrades continued the peasant uprisings and spread it across the region. In 1969, at the movement's peak, Charu officially split from the main CPIM party and formed the CPI-ML, with their party slogan reading, "China's chairman is our chairman. China's path is our path." Charu wholeheartedly believed that the only reason that India had not had a full revolution was because of the revisionism of both the CPI and CPIM. Now, I'm not saying that either or party on the left in India is morally good or bad or whatever, but it is worth looking at how these leftist parties have affected the workers where they operate. For instance, a quick note on the CPIM in Kerala. The main reason they've been so popular and still in power in Kerala is because of good policies. With very popular local self-governance policies and the immensely popular Kudumbashree mission, which has 4.8 million women signed up to it, to organize on a 3-tier level unlike anywhere else in India, these groups of working class women not only hold neighborhood committees but engage in producing food and raising millions of dollars for flood relief and landslides. Not to mention the leaps and bounds the state has made in education compared to other states of India. And if we're being honest, if it wasn't for the CPIM and the very radical roots of workers' movements in Kerala, we wouldn't have those policies. Having said that, due to the nature of electoral politics and having to exist within the larger context of a very reactionary India and needing to form strategic coalitions with centrist parties and the desire to adopt right-wing and nationalist framing on issues to capture votes that allow them to hold power in the first place. All of these conditions make it very difficult to be a leftist party. Even instances of using the state police to crush workers' protests, like what happened to those who protested the building of Adani's port, for instance, there is the valid question of democratic backsliding, even in relatively progressive states like Kerala. Pretty much like every socialist identified government around the world that engages in some level of state capitalism. Modern critics within the left in Kerala also see this as another instance of pushing the ball down the road and merely postponing or slowing down what seems to be the inevitable creep of corporate control. Coming back to Charu, a Marxist-Leninist Maoist thought would inform the basis of what came to be the Naxalite movement's ideology. Charu wrote what is known as the Historic 8 documents, which outlined precisely what the Naxalite movement seeks to achieve. Oh, and considering the fact that he based his line of annihilation policy on Mao's work, Mao, when talking about the use of violence, elaborated on the fact that you needed a highly organized and numerically superior force to encircle and overwhelm a city. This was not something that Charu had at the time, and this became fatally apparent when the Congress government under Indira Gandhi at the time commenced Operation Steeplechase in 1971 to crush the movement that had spread to the streets of Calcutta. Operation Steeplechase was a coordinated operation by the police, the army, and the CRPF. The well-armed security forces managed to arrest hundreds of Maoists and seemingly crush the movement within 45 days. Members of the movement look back on those days as the result of a string of miscalculations made without having a mass base ready for revolution. By their own admission, the unorganized nature of the violence in 1970 and 1971 allowed for random acts of individual violence instead of an organized revolution. The problem here wasn't Charu's or the Naxalites' analysis of the nature of India. No, that was quite accurate. Charu's stated aim was to ignite an agrarian revolution among the peasantry, with the petit bourgeois intelligentsia also playing a role. However, the movement burning libraries and trying to assassinate intellectuals was quite contradictory, and with the involvement of state actors like Abhay Das, there's no real way of telling just to what extent state officials had interfered and instigated violence as well. Charu was captured by the police on 16th July 1972 and was pronounced dead in custody on the 28th of July. The police said that the official cause of death was a heart attack, but everyone knew that the police had just decided to torture and then assassinate Charu. In fact, the police station he was held at was the notorious Alipur jail. This was a central jail that was literally used by the British to torture Indian revolutionaries, like the revolutionary Parul Mukherjee. She was a dual pistol wielding local organizer who literally conspired to assassinate the British governor. Someone who will a gajillion % be called a terrorist by a lot of Indians living right now. Subhash Chandra Bose was also held in this jail, and I know how many of you love that guy. So Charu being held here as well was a terrifying affirmation of the movement's belief that the empire had merely handed over power of India to friendly and reliable hands, another agreeable ruling class, who would go on to open up the country's resources for foreign exploitation. But something we forget about movements like this is that it's not just about one charismatic figure. We often discount the will of the masses themselves in the success of these movements. Just because Charu was assassinated and many other Maoist cadres were also killed in jail, none of it automatically solved the underlying issues of what caused them to revolt in the first place. And it certainly does not change the power dynamic between the state and the people it claims to have a monopoly of violence over, which is why right after this, the remaining Adivasi Naxals retreated into the forests, where they split into numerous factions. During this time, apparently there were more than 30 Marxist-Leninist groups in the forest in East India, and none of them were unified, by the way. Charu might have been dead, but the material conditions of the Adivasis and Dalits in that region did not change at all. And therefore, the movement lived on. The new leadership that took charge began to reassess the mistakes of the failed revolution. And they regrouped and began to employ different tactics and different rules of engagement. One of the largest groups of the splinter factions of the CPIML was the PWG, the People's War Group. The PWG was formally announced as a separate party in 1980 under the leadership of Telugu Maoist leader Kondapalli Siddharamaiah. As part of the movement's practice of self-criticism, they arranged meetings to discuss the series of things that had gone wrong with the initial movement. Amit Bhattacharya has a great summary of these discussions in his book, Storming the Gates of Heaven. Here are some highlights that he mentions, which give us a pretty good insight to the cognition of the party at the time. In these discussions, they admitted that while the analysis of the nature of the Indian state was correct, in that it was an unjust and unequal society that benefited only the rich while keeping the poor poor, and I think most Indians can agree on that, they acknowledged that there were some aspects of the original movement that were simply counterintuitive. They reasoned that the reason for the factionalism and party splits was due to a failure in practicing democratic centralism in its truest form. They admitted that trying to copy China's path did not make sense for India, and even said that Charu's slogan, China's path is our path, was not really valid, and said that India had her own peculiarities. Definitely did not take into account caste, the vast amount of ununited workers spread across the country, and the uneven way in which India had developed over time, with its vast ethnic nationalities that persist even so many decades after independence. They correctly identified the line of annihilation policy as a left sectarian tactical line that was treated almost as a panacea to any problems of revolution. In their words, other forms of organization and struggle were not only ignored, but were even sometimes condemned as revisionist. No attention was paid to the indispensable task of organizing mass movements and mass organizations. They also admitted that, as a result, the party had become more and more isolated from the people. And on urban guerrilla warfare within cities, they noted that it was a bad idea, simply because they were outgunned. And upon critiquing the psychology of the leadership, they found that the leadership failed to grasp the uneven character of India's development, and therefore they came to the incorrect conclusion that revolution existed everywhere in India. They were in their own bubble. During this time of dialogue between factions in the forests, they also had to settle petty territorial disputes. So the movement went through what is known as the Black Phase in 1993 to 1998, where there was a lot of physical violence and infighting and bloodshed between the parties. Despite all this, they ended up forming a unified party finally in 2004, with thousands upon thousands of indigenous people attending their rallies. All this happened in the short time that the party was still legal. This growing power of the Maoists and popularity among the masses of indigenous people in South and Central India was seen as a huge threat to the central government, especially with its capitalistic aspirations, and therefore they banned the party in 2009. They would be banned under the state's favorite act, the UAPA, and then declared a terrorist organization, despite having mass support from indigenous people all over the country. The PWG had decided to build an actual standing army that was better disciplined, better trained, and better prepared for another guerrilla war. This army would need a base, and therefore they chose Dandakaranya forest. One of the reasons they decided to form this standing army was their experience in Andhra Pradesh, where its land to tiller campaign led to direct clashes with landlords in the state, and the party found it impossible to withstand the onslaught without a trained fighting force. A good chunk of the next section is referenced from Arundhati Roy's time with living with the Maoists in Dandakaranya, as recorded in her essays Walking with the Comrades and Trickle-Down Revolution. Arundhati Roy interviewed numerous Maoist cadres and indigenous people living in Dandakaranya. They outlined the material and social conditions of the region before the movement set up shop there. Dandakaranya is part of what the British used to call Gondwana, or the land of the Gonds. The modern-day states of Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, Andhra Pradesh, and Maharashtra slice through this massive forest. The PWG weren't the first group to organize in this forest. In fact, in the late 70s, the Ramakrishna Mission and the Gayatri Samaj had begun opening schools in the villages. In North Bastar, Baba Bihari Das had initiated an aggressive drive to bring tribals back to the Hindu fold. This campaign mirrored the attempts of other proselytizing missions that the Hindu right claims to not be like, and also incorporated a campaign to denigrate tribal culture, induce self-hatred, and introduce Hinduism's greatest gift, caste. the Hindu organizations began to essentially convert the village chiefs and prominent landlords. Wealthy locals like Mahendra Karma, the founder of the Salwa Judum, who we will talk about later, were conferred the status of Dvij, or twice-born Brahmin. As part of the Hindutva drive to Sanskritize and Hinduize the local population and region, they also changed a lot of the town names. Inar village became Chinnari. On the voter list, tribal names were changed to Sanskrit names, like how Masa Karma changed his name to Mahendra Karma. And those Adivasi people who did not come forward to join in on this Hinduization and Sanskritization were declared Katwas, or untouchable. These Katwas naturally became the main constituency of Adivasis to join the Maoist movements. The landlords didn't like these extremist ideas of demanding higher wages that the Maoists were spreading among their workers. So the police would start violently cracking down on any signs of organization and mobilization. In November 1980, Gadchiroli, the local police opened fire on one such village workers meeting, and in the process killing Pedi Shankar, who was an organizer with the PWG. This didn't stop the PWG's organizing though, and in 1981 they returned after a brief retreat into the forests. They began to organize the tribal communities to demand a rise in the prices they were being paid for tendu leaves that are used to make bidis, which are more widely smoked than cigarettes in India. At the time, traders paid just 3 paisa for a bundle of 50 leaves. Yeah, it was essentially slave labor. The PWG organized the workers to strike, and they were successful, and they managed to increase the price they were paid from 3 to 6 paisa, which again, of course, is not enough, but in the grand scheme of things, it began to get people to understand at the time that they were being ripped off and taken advantage of. So they continued to strike and continued to mobilize and demand better. And by the early 2000s, that amount for tendu leaves went from 3 paisa to a whole 1 rupee. Every season, the government floats tenders and gives middlemen contractors the permission to extract a fixed amount of leaves from the tribal communities. This number is usually between 1,500 to 5,000 manak boras, the name for a bundle, the standard bag size. Each manak bora contains 1,000 bundles. Now, there's no real oversight by the government to see if the middlemen are actually extracting more than what they were given permission for though. And by the time these tendu leaves actually hit the market, they're not sold in manak boras, they're sold in kilos. This is where the gross nature of the theft actually comes to light, where the conversion of manak boras to kilos is controlled by the middlemen contractors. The most conservative estimate puts the profit per standard bag at 1,100 rupees, and that was in 2000s numbers. So even if a contractor were to stick to the rules and extract 5,000 units as allowed by the government, they're making 5.5 million rupees. And again, that is a ridiculously conservative estimate. Meanwhile, the people who do all the work and take all the risks make just enough to survive until the next season. The Maoists also agitated against the giant corporation Ballarpur Paper Mills, one of the largest paper manufacturers in India. Ballarpur Industries is headquartered in Gurgaon in Haryana and has subsidiaries everywhere, including in Malaysia. These companies are owned by the Thapar family.
The key ingredients in your success story, which I appreciate, of course, is the role that capitalism is playing over there.
Europe, capitalism has become too benign. And then you get dynamic capitalism like you get in Israel or in India, where everybody wants to make a buck and they don't want to wait for the next pie.
The Enforcement Directorate has arrested Gautam Thapar, promoter of Avanta Group, in an alleged money laundering case.
The government gave the Thapar family a 45-year contract to extract 150,000 tons of bamboo at a massively subsidized rate. The Adivasi community were to get paid 10 paisa per bundle, which consisted of 20 combs of bamboo. Remember, the Adivasi communities are not even part of any of these talks. The way this works is the government offers up Adivasi resources for sale as a middleman itself, and offers privileged business families like the Thapars ridiculous deals. And it's up to the Adivasis to demand higher wages. the actual workers who do the work do not get a seat at the table in these negotiations, and they are stuck reacting to every wrench this unjust system throws at them. So the PWG agitated to organize against these raw deals, and in this case they ended up tripling the price from 10 paisa to 30 paisa. It's because of material gains like this that the indigenous people in the region began to see the PWG and other Maoist parties as parties that actually got results. Unlike the other political parties like the BJP and Congress or whoever who performatively would wash their feet and show how look, we are not afraid to touch you, and do all these performances. So because the PWG were getting material wins for the party instead of all this performance, thousands of other Vasis began to join the PWG. Not to mention, these mainstream political parties would never investigate the biggest landlord at the time, the Forest Department. From the point of view of the indigenous people, the rather ironically named Forest Department was notorious in these areas, appearing in villages like bandits. They would prevent people from farming their fields, collecting firewood, plucking leaves, grazing their cattle. They are also notorious for directly harming the environment, all to prevent indigenous people from actually farming and doing what they have to do to survive. Like how the forest department would use elephants to trample through Adivasi fields and sprinkle babool seeds in order to destroy the soil. The babool plant is an invasive species in the region, and the forest department weaponizes this to directly inflict economic harm upon the Adivasi people in the region. All of this was allowed because the people of the forest were declared illegal by the state. The indigenous people have their own agency and, quite frankly, did not even need a party like the PWG to instigate them to resist here. It is human to resist against any oppressor. Therefore, the indigenous people rebelled against the forest department. The people began to cultivate crops and set up water harvesting stations and so on. The forest department would retaliate by burning more villages and declaring them illegal. In 1986, the government announced a new national park in Bijapur, which to rich people living in the cities of India was an attractive thing that virtue signaled environmental conservation. But in reality, this project was going to evict 60 villages. More than half of these villages were evicted and removed by the forest department, internally displaced. And that's when the PWG moved in and demolished the construction camps. Indigenous villagers would literally capture forest officials, tie them to trees and beat them up. Eventually, the forest department was chased out of their home, and as a result, between 1986 and 2000, the PWG redistributed 300,000 acres of land to the villagers, making it so for a time that there were no landless peasants anymore in that region, something the government had never been able to do for the people here. These facts will naturally rub up against people's constructs of nationalism and create a very uncomfortable psychological reaction, especially with someone talking about it in such a blunt and straightforward manner. These wins by the tribal people proved to them that freedom from corporate exploitation was possible. Many could now taste a different reality. To many here, it meant more than even Indian independence. The PWG, once an organization of 7 squads, now had millions of members across indigenous tribes, covering 60,000 square kilometers of land. With the redistribution of land, of course, came new responsibilities like irrigation, agricultural productivity, medicine, and so on. Military alone could not deal with these factors of basic governance. So the people separated what they call mass work from military work. Tandakaranya forest is governed by a complex system of Jantana Sarkars, or people's governments. It is a form of radical democracy based on a mixture of indigenous practices, ideas from the Vietnamese liberation struggle, and the Chinese Revolution. Each Jantana Sarkar is elected by a cluster of villages whose population can range from 500 to 5,000. These people's governments have 9 departments. Krishi, meaning agriculture, Vyapar Upyog, meaning trade and industry, Arthik, meaning economic, Nyay or justice, Raksha or defense, hospital for health of course, Jan Sampark for public relations, school riti rivaj or education and culture, and lastly, jungle. A group of Jantara Sarkars or people's governments come under an area committee. 3 of these area committees make up one division. In total, as of Arundhati Roy's estimation in the 2010s, there were 10 divisions in Dandakaranya. If someone has an updated number from the region, please feel free to comment. The party also agitated against patriarchal norms in tribal culture as well, by setting up organizations like the Adivasi Mahila Sangatan, which evolved into the Krantikari Adivasi Mahila Sangatan or CAMS, which at the time of counting had more than 90,000 tribal women registered. They were all Maoists. This wing of the party campaigned against issues like forced marriages and regressive customs like the shunning of women on their periods. This women's organization would also be banned by the Indian government. These developments and liberation of the areas was good for a large amount of tribal people. However, the police were called in by the authoritarian state to crack down on this form of parallel governance that they deemed chaos and declared illegal. Also, they couldn't make as much money off an autonomous region. They could make money off weapons though. Yeah. This led to a series of bloodshed between the CPI-ML People's War aligned Adivasis and Dalits and state police. It led to encounters, which is the Indian way of saying extrajudicial killing or execution without trial by the police. This state-induced chaos and violence would cause strife within the communities and also expose the class differences within tribal society. You see, in many of these liberated zones that the Adivasis and Maoists fought so hard to reclaim, as soon as the forest department was kicked out, many of the affluent chiefs and patriarchs swooped in to grab land, as they sought to replace the forest department and take up the mantle of exploiter. These mukhyas and village chiefs would later become the Dwij brigades that the state would use to suppress the poorer indigenous population. Because of the bottom-up nature of the tribal people's governance in the region, it threatened the power and influence of the relatively wealthy chiefs and patriarchs. They saw the PWG as a challenge to their status and power over tribal society. One such landlord was Mahendra Karma, who was at the time a member of the CPI. In 1990, Mahendra Karma initiated a campaign that he called Jan Jagran Abhiyan, meaning Public Awakening Campaign. With the support of the Madhya Pradesh police, he gathered around 300 people. He formed a hunting party to comb the forest in order to burn, kill, and fear other indigenous people. On behalf of the state, the Adivasis and the PWG responded by killing the most notorious landlords. And within just a few months, the Jan Jagran Abhiyan was defeated. Mahendra Karma then left the CPI and joined the Congress party, where he again tried to revive his anti-tribal militia once more, but this time it faded away much quicker than before. But then in 2005, luck struck for Mahendra Karma when the BJP government of Chhattisgarh signed 2 MOUs to set up integrated steel plants on tribal lands. MOU number 1 was for 70 billion rupees with Essar Steel, and the other one was for 100 billion rupees with Tata Steel. It was around this time that Manmohan Singh started speaking about leftist extremism being the biggest threat to India's development, and around the same time that the Andhra Pradesh government had killed more than 1,600 Adivasi Maoist cadres. Manmohan Singh's statements would send the share prices of mining companies soaring to new heights. The Indian mainstream media, famous for being owned by the same billionaires who had interests in exploiting tribal lands, ran with a new demonization campaign to paint Maoists and indigenous people as violent barbarians and monsters and terrorists. This was ample red meat for the urban privileged classes of India. For many educated liberals in India and the West, the indigenous people and tribal lands were worthy sacrificial offerings to the younger god in the pantheon. the god of the free market, all in the name of development. In light of this new wave of bloodthirst and consent from mainstream media, Mahendra Karma then called for a secret meeting of village chiefs and landlords in Kutru village in 2005. He then announced the Salwa Judum, or purification hunt. The Salwa Judum was a straightforward ethnic cleansing campaign, and I'm not being hyperbolic. It meant to move people out of their native villages and into roadside police-controlled camps. It was based on a military strategy called strategic hamletting, originally formulated by General Harold Briggs in 1950 when the British were at war against communists in Malaya. Naturally, this tactic became very popular among the Indian Army leadership and has been used in other hot zones like Nagaland, Mizoram and Telangana. The BJP chief minister at the time, Raman Singh, announced that as far as his government was concerned, any villager who did not move into the police designated camps would be declared Maoists. In doing so, they damned the life of the ordinary common villager. Any villager in Bastar going about their daily lives, farming, picking leaves and so on, was declared a terrorist. These vague categorizations and the state's hostile attitude towards journalists in the region gave the police, the Salwa Judum and the state authorities a lot of cover for atrocities. Of course, state stenographers and careerists would get toured around by the security forces, but they aren't journalists. They also willingly broke up thousands of families. Because within each family, they would now have to decide whether to move into these camps run by cops and as a result be declared as compromised by the other Adivasis, or risk staying in their homes and being assaulted and raped and slaughtered by the security forces, and get no justice for it either because the police could then just reason it away as being an encounter with a Maoist. D.S. Manhar, the SP of Bijapur, was recorded ordering the police to burn any villages that refused to move into camps, and any journalist covering the situation to be shot on sight. The Salwa Judum then moved through the villages, burning and killing the indigenous people of the region, with the full cover of the police, the state, and the nation. Hundreds of villages were decimated. More than 60,000 people were displaced and moved into camps. These villagers were not offered basic necessities like healthcare, education, and other rights that Indians in other parts of India take for granted. Some of the areas most affected by the Salwa Judum were the regions in which the Maoists and people's governments had set up water harvesting stations and farming contraptions. The tribal women of the Maoist women's organization CAMS was also targeted by the Salwa Judum, with survivors stating that there was a certain kind of resentful male rage many of the young men in the Salwa Judum embodied. There's a reason why the Salwa Judum was entirely male. Comrade Sushila of CAMS told Arundhati Roy that a common slogan used at the time by the Salwa Judum was "Hum do bibi layenge," meaning we will have 2 wives, we will. 3,000 of these Salwa Judum militias were deputized as SPOs or special police officers and given a salary of 1,500 rupees or $17. The billionaire-owned media then sold this ethnic cleansing campaign as some kind of spontaneous indigenous uprising, rebelling against the apparent terror of the Maoists. The security forces who sat back and allowed the Salwa Judum to do its dirty work for it, then set up camps along the way in the path of its destruction. And like that, they slowly reoccupied what they considered Maoist-controlled territory. They destroyed a large swath of what the Maoist and indigenous people in the area had developed over the last 25 years. In this situation, the Maoist party in the forests reasoned that if they did not react, then they would lose the trust of the indigenous people that they had built over time. Therefore, they struck back in a series of guerrilla ambushes. 26 January 2006, the PLGA attacked Gangalore camp and killed 7 people. 17 July 2006, they attacked the Salwa Judum camp at Arabur and killed 20 people, injuring more than 150. This of course was reported by mainstream media as Maoists attacking an aid relief camp set up by the virtuous government to help people fleeing the terrorism of the Naxalites. 13th December 2006, they attacked another Salwa Judum camp and killed 3 SPOs and 1 constable. On 15th March 2007 came the largest operation. 120 guerrillas attacked the Rani Bodila Kanya ashram, a girls' hostel that had been converted into a barracks for 80 police and SPOs, while the girls still lived in it. That type of occupation, by the way, is still a common practice, where security forces routinely occupy not just hostels and hospitals and whatnot, but Adivasi homes when carrying out what they call Maoist hunting operations. This practice has led to numerous accounts of sexual violence being enacted upon tribal women and children. There have been numerous probes on this, one of them being one carried out by the National Commission for Scheduled Tribes by their chairperson Rameshwar Oraon. You should definitely check that out. Indigenous rights activist Soni Sori, someone who has first-hand experience of this, has also written extensively throughout most of her life. The guerrillas entered the compound, cordoned off the zone in which the girls lived, and attacked the makeshift barracks. 55 policemen and SPOs were killed. None of the girls in the hostel were hurt. Half of the guerrillas who carried out this attack on the front lines were also women. This incident caused massive outrage across India, with essentially the entire country from the right to the left condemning the Maoists for attacking a school and being anti-education. But no one was really interested in why 80 men had turned a girls' hostel into a strategic barracks. For the tribal communities, though, songs were written about this attack, commemorating it in tribal oral traditions. The stark contrast and reaction here must be noted. For tribal women who'd experienced the worst of the injustices by the state, this was seen as justice. These sustained counter-offensives against the state-backed militias eventually caused the Salwa Judum and the police to retreat to their camps. People eventually began returning to their villages, even from the police camps. The SPOs who were paid by the state, however, were told that they could only return if they publicly apologized to the rest of the tribal community and regretted their actions. After this specific episode, many young people joined the Maoists in droves, as they saw a dire need for more community defense. They had learned that their protection was not in the state's interest. The Salwa Judum operation had backfired completely. Word of the atrocities and sexual violence committed by the state-backed militia and police soon reached the cities, and on 5th July 2011, the Salwa Judum would be considered illegal and unconstitutional in Dr. Nandari Sundar and others versus the state of Chhattisgarh and the union government. The court ruled to prohibit the use of indigenous people as SPOs in counterinsurgency operations by the state against the Maoists. Now, of course, in the time of the current Operation Kagar under the BJP, the state is now using what they call the DRG or District Reserve Guard, of which 40% are reportedly indigenous. And it is that 40% reportedly that is on the front lines risking their lives for the state once more. It is essentially the Salwa Judum just in uniform and more levels of bureaucracy, but I'm getting ahead of myself. A draft report by the Committee on State Agrarian Relations and the Unfinished Task of Land Reform under the Ministry of Rural Development, that was a mouthful, stated an important fact that caused a stir in Indian media. This government report stated that Essar Steel and Tata Steel were the main financiers of the Salwa Judum. This government report also stated that this was the biggest grab of land of tribal communities since Columbus. However, since it was a government report, and because facts tend to be cheap to politicians, these two claims conveniently disappeared from the final official report. After all, you couldn't have one of India's favorite billionaires involved. For the Congress government at the time, the MOUs had already been signed with companies like Tata, and those commitments were more important to them to uphold than improving the lives of the indigenous people of Bastar. So the Congress government then deployed the CRPF, the BSF, the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, and all kinds of other goofy names like Greyhounds and whatnot, and the Central Industrial Security Force as part of Operation Green Hunt in 2009. Now let's come to Manmohan Singh. Manmohan Singh was the mild-mannered face of a new neoliberal capitalist India. He served India first as a finance minister, working for Sonia Gandhi, and then as the prime minister. It was his economic policies that led India to the situation it is in now. Not just Hindu nationalism and the BJP. The BJP merely took advantage of the economic realities and the wealth discrepancies ushered into New India with these neoliberal policies. Ashok Mitra, the former finance minister of West Bengal, described Manmohan Singh's rise in his book A Prattler's Tale. In 1991, when India's foreign exchange reserves were dangerously low, the Narasimha Rao government approached the IMF for an emergency loan. The IMF, as the IMF does, to impoverish post-colonial countries like India, agreed on two conditions. The first was a structural adjustment and economic reform. The second was the appointment of a finance minister of their choice. That choice was Manmohan Singh. Manmohan Singh believed in the privatization of virtually everything. Healthcare, education, telecommunication, land, agriculture, everything, no matter the consequences. Just like how Modi right now is simply a face representing the RSS underneath. Sonia Gandhi, Rahul Gandhi, and the elite of the Congress party were merely the face that would go around performing like actors to appease the populations and farm them for votes, while the country was really being run by a coven of billionaires, unelected judges, and oligarchs. The democracy of India only really exists to protect the interests of the ultra-rich. There is a two-tiered system of justice in India, one that throws the book at the poorer sections of society, those who were born with the wrong last name and wrong religion, while the children of the ultra-rich and well-connected get away with literal murder, with their only punishments being writing an essay. Like, no joke, that actually happened. And it happens all the time. A more famous recent case being of rich kid Vedant Agarwal killing 2 motorcycle riders. The court simply asked him to write an essay as repentance for killing 2 people. Vedant, ironically named, is the son of prominent Pune business family, the Agarwals, who own Brahma Corp. A bit on the nose, if you know what I mean. But anyway, he got off scot-free because he was a Brahmin son of a rich family. If he had a different last name, if he was Muslim from a not-so-rich family, then he'd be in jail and tortured by the police. Another very prominent rich person from the Congress party from Tamil Nadu, P. Chidambaram, outlined new neoliberal India's path forward in 2007 at a Harvard lecture, far, far away from the people it would impact the most. He called the lecture Poor Rich Countries, the Challenges of Development. In this lecture, he said very plainly, democracy, rather the institutions of democracy and the legacy of the socialist era have actually added to the challenge of development. Let me explain with some examples. India's mineral resources include coal, the 4th largest reserve in the world, iron ore, manganese, bauxite, titanium ore, chromite, diamonds, natural gas, petroleum, limestone. Common sense tells us that we should mine these resources quickly and efficiently. That requires huge capital, efficient organizations, and a policy environment that will allow market forces to operate. None of these factors are present today in the mining sector. Our efforts to attract private investment in prospecting and mining have by and large failed. Meanwhile, the sector remains virtually captive in the hands of the state government. Opposing any change in the status quo are groups that espouse the cause of the forests or the environment or the tribal population. He rambles on and elaborates and eventually goes on to say, the only issue before was payment and adequate compensation. The situation has changed. There are new stakeholders in every project. Their claims have to be recognized. We are now obliged to address issues such as environmental impact assessment, justification for compulsory acquisition, right compensation, solatium, rehabilitation and resettlement of the displaced persons, alternative house sites and farmland, and one job for each affected family. Bit of a weird speech. Some of you may have picked up on the colonizer type vibe from it. Like, this is what I would imagine a liberal presenting official of the East India Company would be saying as they extracted resources from India. But because it's coming from a member of the Indian government and an Indian billionaire, you might be thinking, oh well, difficult things must be done in the name of development. Except the unfortunate reality is that the average Indian, even the middle class Indians aspiring to be one of these untouchable, rich, ruling class billionaires, they will not see the benefits of any of this, of this sacrificial ritual. The only ones who've benefited so far are giant multinational corporations who have no incentive at all to better the lives of the Indian people. Corporate greed and manufactured killing of empathy by the corporate media towards our own people has imbued a certain kind of cannibalistic character to this situation. You see, even though many people watching this video will see left-wing policies like land distribution as extremist, I don't think they'll ever concede that the governments themselves, so in this case the Indian government, already has a land redistribution program. It's the redistribution of land from the poor to the rich. It's socialism for the rich. That's literally what land grabbing is. It is land redistribution. That is why India and many other countries have the concept of special economic zones, tailor-made for the rich who do not want to have to deal with these pesky regulations and workers' rights interfering with profits. These rich families and multinational corporations need cheap labor of tribal and Dalit people. They need the access to minerals and resources sitting under our beautiful landscapes. In their eyes, it's like the environment is selfishly hiding these bounties from them and from the greater development of India. You see, the rich families and corporations are merely trying to provide jobs to these lowly tribals by taking their lands. Sure, they'll give them slave wages, just enough to sustain them for another season of work, and virtually no political representation. This equation, the current equation, is of course not radical, right? It is completely apolitical. No, it is the activists and the parties trying to make the lives of tribal people marginally better. They're the radicals. We as a society, and not just us but many societies around the world, have fostered a deep-rooted hatred for the plight of regular working people. We only respect doctors, lawyers, and so on with a certain set of last names and caste backgrounds. This contempt for regular working people has translated to the way the government acts against regular people who speak out and merely ask for the most basic of things. Progressive movements in India have been crushed to a pulp by the centrists and the right wing that control the government and the mainstream culture in India. Even a segregated Dalit settlement asking the local police to help clean their segregated well so they can draw water for everyday activities is seen as radical. It is no surprise then that the Modi government would flex collective punishment as a valid political strategy. That is how, when you build a culture of contempt and hatred, it directly translates into your policies. It presents itself today to the world in all its saffron glory. The Vishwaguru of the world, the great awaited Ram Raja, a new dawn for a powerful, bold India, a hateful one, not afraid to strike down its enemies, which in practice of course means poor people. It is inevitable that this flippant attitude and a collective lack of respect for human life will cause even the most educated, affluent children of India who think they are liberal to cheer for the restriction of a basic human right like water. This is the kind of disregard and disrespect shown to human life when it comes to Adivasi people and their movements. This is why the government has decided not to agree to the recent ceasefire by the CPI Maoist and come to talks, but instead use the opportunity once more to kill as many members affiliated with it as possible, to declare a triumph over the poorest people in the country. And if you think that this violence is only reserved for members of the CPI Maoist, you are mistaken. One example out of an ocean that you would find like this is the case of PCAPA, the People's Committee Against Police Atrocities. This organization wasn't even asking for things like land rights. They were asking for the Superintendent of Police of Largar to apologize to the Adivasi community for the atrocities the police had committed against it. The police, as we know, were not going to do this. So instead, they declared war on this non-violent organization. After a series of brutal executions, the PCAPA was then declared by the state as a banned Maoist organization when they were not. Its leaders have been either jailed or shot. That is the reward for non-violent organizations who dared to organize peacefully while committing the crime of being born in the Adivasi community. Indian corporate media, well known for being one of the worst in the world, mocked for its lack of journalistic integrity worldwide, would parade the corpse of the PCAPA organization to blame it for various unrelated things like placing blame for the horrific train derailment in Jharkhand, West Bengal, in which 150 people lost their lives. The standards of journalism is so bad in India that we still do not know what really happened there. You see, real journalists doing their jobs are rewarded with jail or bullets, or jail and then bullets. But these billionaire-sponsored clowns who wear suits survive because they blame the enemies of the state for everything, whatever the season requires. All of what you've heard from your BJP-loving uncle or your money-loving, journalism-hating news anchors whose talking points those uncles hold up as fact are designed to muddy the waters of what's really happening in the region. It is supposed to fool you into thinking that there is a false middle ground here. It is how we build a society, I suppose, to become rabid centrists. It is how we get centrists to start saying things like, okay, I accept that the tribal people have been wronged, but what do we do? While never really questioning the locus of power. Arundhati Roy mocks the liberal centrist perspective perfectly in a book where she writes, yes, the tribals have been neglected and are having a very bad time. Yes, they need development. Yes, it's the government's fault and it's a great pity. But right now, there's a crisis. We need to get rid of the Maoists, secure the land, and then we can help the tribals. Sound familiar? Israel has supplied India with weaponry since its earliest wars, whether it was the war with China or the numerous Indo-Pakistan wars. But that material support was relatively minuscule and also covert. It was in the 2000s, in a post-9/11 world, and in India, a post-Babri Masjid world and Gujarat riots world, that India and Israel really started to become open about the relationship. Under Modi, though, since 2014, that relationship has transformed India into becoming Israel's largest buyer of arms, which includes surveillance tech like Pegasus, unmanned aerial vehicles, Tavor rifles, and so on. The Garud helicopter operators who fire from side-mounted machine guns into the forests have been trained by the Israelis for a long time, like as evidence in this report of them training together in Israel in 2017. The Israeli Heron drones are known to terrorize villagers in Bastar by dropping bombs on them. Villagers have even recovered drones that were shot down to show as proof to the rest of India and the world, because what use is just the word of a tribal person? The head of Amnesty International's security lab, I'm going to put this name up here because I do not speak Gaelic. This report stated in 2023, journalists in India face the threat of unlawful surveillance simply for doing their jobs, alongside other tools of repression including imprisonment under draconian laws, smear campaigns, harassment and intimidation. They confirmed that Siddhartha Varadarajan, the founding editor of The Wire, and Anand Mangnale, the South Asian editor of the Organized Crime and Corruption Report Project, were among the numerous journalists recently targeted with Pegasus software on their devices. In October 2023, Apple sent out notifications to numerous journalists and politicians in India, politicians who were political opponents of the BJP, notifying them that their devices were being targeted by state-sponsored spyware. The security lab of Amnesty International recovered evidence from Anand Mangnale's device about a zero-click exploit, which I think we should all be very aware of. It was an exploit sent by iMessage. A zero-click exploit, by the way, allows malicious spyware to be installed without the user having to even click on a link. The recovered samples were consistent with the Israeli NSO group's BlastPass exploit. Let's spend some time on the harsh realities of being a journalist in India. In the Journalistic Freedom Index by Reporters Without Borders, India currently ranks 151 out of 180 countries, a position that is contradictory to its claims of being the world's largest democracy. The International Federation of Journalists have tallied that 73 journalists have been killed in India since 2005. Siddharta Deb notes in his brilliant book, Twilight Prisoners, read that book, that 9 of these journalists alone were killed in 2015. One of them allegedly set on fire by a policeman who was working for a politician accused of rape. And in the case of the 30 journalists who were killed since 2010, there have been exactly one conviction, and that's according to the Indian media watchdog The Hoot. The killing of journalist Gauri Lankesh in 2017 is another assassination in a larger struggle against Hindu nationalism, crony capitalism, casteism and sexism. When Gauri began asking questions about crony capitalism early on in her career, it led her in 2004 to attend a press conference held by the not yet banned Naxalites. One of the Maoist leaders she met there was Saket Rajan, who was also a former classmate of Gauri's and whose father was literally an officer in the army. Saket himself was a journalist and writer who often wrote about uranium enrichment projects, displacement of indigenous communities, and bonded labor practices. He's even written a book about the history of Karnataka. His investigations and perhaps also the fact that his father himself was an officer radicalized him to become a guerrilla. 8 months after this meeting, Saket would be executed in Chikmagalur by the state police with a bullet to the head. Gauri wrote an article about this encounter right after it happened, but her own brother threatened her with a revolver because of how sympathetic it seemed to the Maoists. This brother, by the way, Indrajit, would later join the BJP. Gauri had simply been writing about encouraging the government to engage in peace talks with the Maoists, instead of just trying to kill them all. She was also a vocal critic of rising Hindu nationalism in India at the time. She also wrote about casteism and violence. She was also vocal about her own community, the Lingayats, and how they were not part of the Hindu fold. Which is true, by the way. The Lingayat tradition has a very long history of overtly rejecting Vedic Brahmanism. But in adding to this conversation at the time, she drew the ire of prominent conservative Lingayats who benefited from being a part of the Hindu fold in Karnataka. You see, the Lingayats had become a big voting bloc for the BJP and factored into a big part of their election strategies in the south. And Gauri had been a thorn in local BJP politicians' sides. Now, how is this relevant? Well, all of this attention she had been gathering now put her on the list of Hindu nationalist terror groups, including the one that eventually did get her, the Sanatan Sanstha, or the SS, an organization run by a fake doctor who claims to be a religious hypnotherapist guru. This group was responsible for a terrorist bomb blast in a marketplace in Goa as well, by the way. We know it was them because the bomb exploded before the SS workers could plant it at the Narakasur pre-Diwali festival. As usual, their plan had been to blame Muslims for the blast. Not the first time they've done this. So in September 2017, Gauri Lankesh was gunned down right outside her house by 2 men on a motorcycle. The same group had also carried out similar politically motivated assassinations on the scholar M.M. Kalburji, Govind Pansare as well, who was an author and left-wing trade unionist, and Narendra Dabolkar, who was a doctor and activist. You may have noticed that all of these names are Hindu, and you see, that's the point. Groups like the SS in India specifically target Hindus. Their goal is to attack those in the privileged majority whom they've declared as traitors to the cause of Hindu Rashtra. It is a literal killing of progressive voices within the Hindu population. All of these people were assassinated using .762 rounds, fired from a makeshift pistol made by SS workers. All of the victims had been declared Durjan and Dharmadrohi by the SS and their leadership. All of this language as well is based on a book that they followed, Shatra Dharma Sadhana, written by that guru hypnotherapist. And is this terror outfit and literature that has led to death of Indians in the privileged majority banned in India? Nope. Mainstream media in India actually runs cover for them instead. And that's just the loosely affiliated wink wink, nod nod, not officially the BJP groups in India. The mainstream BJP, on the other hand, don't need to build makeshift pistols or risk being blown up by their own bombs. If they want to find an Indian progressive, they don't need to skulk about local libraries to snoop for their targets' addresses. True story, by the way, that's actually how the SS found Gauri's address. Nah. The BJP buys Israeli spyware using your taxpayer money. Take the example of the human rights activist from Kerala, Rona Wilson, who had moved to Delhi to devote his entire life campaigning on behalf of political prisoners in India's largest prison, Tihar Jail. In April 2018, two gangs of policemen showed up at Rona's one-bedroom apartment in Delhi at 6 a.m. They spent the next 8 hours rummaging through all his belongings, snooping through his devices, scouring the titles of his books. Rona was obviously annoyed but was cooperative, and he just asked them to put everything back after they were done. When the police left, they took Rona's laptop, a USB, and his phone. 7 weeks after the raid, the police returned and arrested him on suspicion to assassinate Modi and to overthrow the Indian government in a Maoist conspiracy. They also considered a Marx for Beginners book as evidence that he was a Maoist. The supposed evidence also contained badly written but very direct email conversations between Rona Wilson and this imaginary comrade Prakash. Okay. Owing to the suspicious nature of said evidence and the long, well-documented history of incompetence and tampering by Indian police, Wilson's lawyers sent a cloned copy of his hard drive to a US-based third-party digital forensics lab called Arsenal Consulting. In 2021, Arsenal reported that incriminating evidence had been actually planted on Wilson's laptop 22 months before that police raid. The hackers had actually created a fake account pretending to be one of Rona's friends, the poet Varavara Rao. Using this account, the hackers sent a Dropbox link to Rona's email, which upon clicking installed a command and control server on Rona's laptop. And Arsenal confirmed that the software was of Israeli NSO origin, meaning Pegasus. Once the malware was installed over the course of a year, the hackers actually continued to deposit 32 incriminating documents on Rona's laptop on a hidden folder, including that infamous letter that suspiciously spelled out the plot to end Modi Raj, which was blasted across mainstream media and YouTube accounts that also frustratingly act as state stenographers. This is unfortunately what happens to people with a conscience in India who are merely trying to better their communities around them in any way they can. Rona and fellow detainee Sudhir Daule were finally released on bail just this year, although with limited rights and their passports confiscated. The origins of the so-called conspiracy was traced to a progressive festival organized by 2 retired judges, held in Pune in 2017. This festival was called Elgar Parishad. It was held right before a famous Dalit military victory over privileged caste oppressors and landlords in a village called Bhima Koregaon. It was an event in which historically oppressed Dalit soldiers serving in a British regiment defeated a privileged caste Hindu army, quite a sore spot for India's privileged right wing. Topics covered during the festival were critiques to Hindutva and the violent state-approved extremism the various Hindutva groups perpetrate on the nation, not too different from what's covered on this channel. However, the next day, when Dalits were marching towards the commemoration site in Bhima Koregaon, they were beaten and pelted with stones by a Hindu mob. Someone was actually killed in this riot. When the investigation revealed that the 2 local instigators were privileged caste members of Hindu nationalist organizations, the investigation, politicians, and media apparatus turned the situation into a Maoist conspiracy to divide the nation. This is the media wave that the Hindu right used, even though they started the violence, to arrest long-time targets like Rona Wilson, who wasn't even in Pune when the festival happened. Rona Wilson was booked under the UAPA. Him and 15 other humanitarian activists were put behind bars. All those arrested were activists, lawyers, and writers who were engaged in land rights activism, feminism, and progressive battles. The oldest was Stan Swamy, an octogenarian activist suffering from Parkinson's disease himself. He could not even drink water without a straw, which the jailers kept denying him, and the Modi government had deemed him a terrorist. Stan Swamy contracted COVID while in prison and received no medical attention, and therefore died under the watchful eye of the state. This, of course, drew no response from India's supreme leader, Modi, despite global condemnation. These are but a glimpse of the repression that is directed towards the urban left. As I said before, a more direct and different approach of policing is reserved for activists on the front lines in Bastar. 33-year-old Mukesh Chandrakar, a journalist and YouTuber from Bastar, was killed on Jan 1st, 2025, the same month that Rona and Sudhir were released. His body was found in a septic tank in Bijapur. The autopsy revealed that he had several head fractures as well. His heart was ripped out and he had a broken neck. Mukesh was investigating a shady road project in the resource-rich conflict zone and uncovered a massive case of corruption. There are many other stories that are, quite frankly, too horrifying to speak out loud and would definitely get me banned off YouTube or something. But I will say this, the difference between the BJP's Operation Kagar and the Congress-led operations that have preceded it is that there's no pretending this time around. So the current government literally just says that they're not interested in talking with any resistance groups, whether they are Maoist or CPI aligned or even ARP aligned. It doesn't matter. There's no window dressing this time, no pretending to save indigenous people or anything of that sort, no lip service. The goal of Operation Kagar is very clear. It is to ethnically cleanse the resource-rich region of human beings so that parasitic billionaires can move in and suck the land dry like leeches. It has the full Indian media machinery behind it, just like before, and the rotting corpse of Indian nationalism on a stick to justify any and all manner of crimes. Today, there are around 300 security camps around Bastar, with a troop-to-civilian ratio of 1:9. These camps have been rebranded by the Indian state as welfare camps, in a grotesque inversion of morality that we see in today's politics, where the biggest oppressors often play the victims. Any forms of non-violent resistance by indigenous communities, like the Mulvasi Bachao Manch, which formed in 2021, by the way, after a massacre of indigenous people by the police in Silgar, responded to with more violence from the state. The Indian government also recently banned the Mulvasi Bachao Manch in 2024 and arrested more than 30 of its young members. Like all the politicians before, the ruling party has already claimed victory over Naxalism. But if any of us are being honest, as long as private corporations are allowed to rake Indian lands for personal profit, and as long as the indigenous people of India are marginalized, resistance will never end. Whether it be the kings of old, the British East India Company, Congress, the BJP, or whatever political party in the future, history has shown that the indigenous people of India will continue to resist in whatever form they can.